Reactive Training Systems.
Hey, what's up? Welcome back to the Reactive Training Systems podcast. I'm Coach Ross Lepla. Today we have something a little bit different for you. We went a little bit different path, and it was a result of a conversation that Mike, John, and myself were having a couple of days ago, probably a couple of weeks ago now at this point. One of the things that's been really cool for John and I, having been working for Mike for nearly 10 years now and Athletes Forum prior to that, so it's been a long time, is getting to see this evolution of Mike as a coach from the time that we worked together, from even before that with our influence of reading the Reactive Training Systems manual, all kinds of really neat things. And it begs the question, like, what's this driving thing? You've heard us talk about what is your why a lot of times, and we wanted to pluck at that. So today, John and I are going to be interviewing Mike and asking him about different things of coaching and like what drives him and a couple of neat little things for you. I hope you enjoy a little bit different version of the RTS podcast as John and I poke and prod at Mike a little bit and see what drives him and find out what drives the man that brought you RPE auto-regulated training to the sport of powerlifting. No, I think we were having the conversation the other day.
Attend the session on Tuesday to discuss why coaching, why powerlifting.
Yeah, like we were having that discussion the other day and just thinking about the tenure of coaching. And Mike, you've been at it for a real long time. And it's like, why, like what drew you away from the Air Force? Like you could have had a long career in there. Like your wife has had a long career in the Air Force. Like that could have been a very valid path for you. But there was something that pulled you and drew you away from that. And I tend to, like, I think there's a couple of layers to it too. It's not just a straightforward answer, but like, why coaching? Why powerlifting? Like there's a couple of parts in there. It's not just one or the other. There's multiple things. And I just got really curious about that. Like I've heard you say some things here and there over the years, but never necessarily in one like condensed conversation. And I thought that would be really neat to talk through and share with our listeners and our audience.
Cool. I mean, that's hopefully an interesting line of questioning. I mean, I was always better at this than I was at the Air Force. That's for sure. So, I mean, there's definitely a skill component to it. I joined the Air Force as a young man because I thought that would be cool. And there were a lot of like job things that I wanted to do. And, you know, being an officer in the military sounded cool. And there is some of it that I liked, but there's a lot of it that didn't suit me. And, you know, a lot of people kind of go through that in their 20s. You try something and you're like, some of this is okay, but some of it's not. And so you kind of find your way. But I mean, I've been obsessed with powerlifting since I was 12 years old. So just like couldn't leave it alone, even if I wanted to. So part of it was that, you know, and the coaching came on as like a means to continue to explore powerlifting and see if I could solve more of the puzzle. And, you know, along the way I've discovered like, hey, not only do I like coaching, I'm good at it. And it helps me, it helps them, help the athletes. And I think it's been mutually a good thing.
Has the puzzle been solved?
No, I mean, that's never right. I do feel like real meaningful progress has been made though. We always try to figure out more stuff, right? Like we want more detail, more precision, fewer edge cases, fewer people left out. As we like learn more about training, learn more about like what makes the best system for an individual, not just like a large group of people, but for you, how do I do the best that I can to make each individual as strong as they can be? We're figuring out more and more all the time. And in some cases, we might be close to having it solved. I mean, I say that reluctantly because every time I think that, the worm turns, and we have more to do. But I am getting to the point where in some cases I'm like, there might be more here. Like stress index, for example. Like, is this formula that we've been working on to quantify workload and help us to prescribe the right number of sets for anybody in any situation, any changes to blocks or intensities or protocols and things like that. And I think we're getting pretty close to having that figured out. I was talking with some RTS coaches about this recently, where we're like, is this something that can be individualized? And yes, it is. It's probably a little bit different. The way fives land with me is probably a little bit different than the way fives land with you. High RPE and low RPE, that's maybe the example that people can feel a little bit more. Is like some people train high RPE and that's fine. And then other people, as soon as they touch high RPE, they're crushed. So can we individualize something like stress index? Yeah, you can. How much difference is that going to make in how many sets you prescribe? Maybe a little bit of a difference. Do you get to the point where further optimizations might make it theoretically more precise, but it never really manifests into an actual difference in the program? Yeah, I mean, I think you can get to that point. And I think once you've optimized to that level, like, okay, what are we doing here? Like we've probably solved that aspect of the problem for all intents and purposes. Now there's all these other aspects that still need to be solved, right? Like this is solving for workload is like one little thing. Now we can maybe put the right weight on the bar. We can lift it the right number of times, but is it the right exercise? Is the timing correct? And then sports psychology is a whole other basket. So, I mean, we're getting closer. There's progress being made, but it's not done. And I'm not sad about that.
Yeah.
I had a follow-up question. So like thinking about the origin story, you kind of were talking about that a little bit, and reflecting on that, like what problem were you trying to solve in the Air Force with the athletes that you were working with and in charge of as head coach? What problem were you trying to solve when RPE became really apparent to you? And then how does that, thinking back to that time, how does that influence the way you look at training today?
That's a good story. So kind of going back to the beginning a little bit. So when RPE, the before times, before RPE was really a thing, I had been reading about RPE in super training because it was a thing in endurance sports and in general fitness, and this concept of like a scale of 1 to 10 on how hard did it feel. Yeah, but it was all very vague, Well, 10 was very strenuous. 9 is pretty strenuous. 8, it was like, well, okay, what does that mean? Now I was reading about this in one context, but then at the same time, also obsessively learning about powerlifting in a lot of different ways all at once, and one of the concepts that's getting talked about a lot during that time was, hey, you don't have to take all your accessory work to failure. If you leave a rep in the tank, maybe now you can do an extra set, or maybe you're just not super smoked for your next session. Leave a rep in the tank. Like 1 rep in reserve could go a long way to helping your training, improve the quality of training. And that was kind of a light bulb moment for me. It's like, well, hey, you could take these two concepts and put them together. So yeah, you can leave 1 rep in the tank, or you could leave 2 or 3 and so on. And then from a practical standpoint, it's like, well, once you get down to like 3 reps in reserve, it gets pretty hard to rate that. So that's where in the original RPE chart, you start to get more qualitative sort of assessments around 7 RPE or something like that. But that was kind of the origin of it. But now, the reason why this was super interesting to me is at the time, everyone that knows anything about training is talking about you've got to learn to listen to your body. You've got to learn when to push, when to pull back. And that's still true, right? This is still a thing that gets talked about, at least with experienced coaches. People still talk about, like, you've got to learn to read the signals, and I was reading about this at the time, and I thought, well, that's great, but how do you do that? Well, there's no real answer to that. You just kind of have to train for 10 years and you just kind of figure it out. Well, that's not very helpful to me, who's at the time coaching a bunch of people who are in like year 2, so how do we help them train like more experienced people? How do we help them read the signals better? Well, RPE was one of those ways. And then a lot of the other tools that we've developed over the years have been other ways that experienced athletes, maybe they didn't call it RPE, maybe they didn't have a specific number scale that they used, but they just kind of could feel when to push it. I need to add another 20 pounds. I need to, go a little lighter today. Maybe I shouldn't take a heavy single. Maybe I should stick more to rep work today. They could read the signals, but it was intuitive. It was this reading that they held internally and couldn't externalize, couldn't teach to anyone else. So a lot of this process has been about, like, okay, let's observe what those things are and try to teach other people how to read the signals.
I think one of the cool little through threads there from like some of the origins of your curiosity with RPE as it relates to now with stress index and finding ways to individualize stress index is just this curiosity of how to continue to develop this system that best allows radical individualized training for the lifter. And like, how far down the rabbit hole can you go in the discovery of this, and what different tools apply, and how does it change the application, and how does it change the protocol design? And it's really neat to think about that, especially for myself. I think about when I first hired you to be my coach was 2014, I think, time range, 14 or 15, somewhere in there. And seeing what it was like when I first came on board with you and how you were teaching it, and the start and the origins of emerging strategies then at that point as well, and seeing where that's gone and how that's transpired in the past several years of working for you and not just being one of your athletes, but seeing that whole process like unfold is kind of really neat and really cool, because you don't get to be in the front row seat to many things like that in life, where you get to see like the progressions going through. A lot of times you just see where it is when you're there for your short amount of time and then you go away. And I think that's really neat to be in the seat that I'm in and having witnessed that.
You guys deserve a lot of credit, because that's not an easy path to follow either. That, you learn a system and you learn that, hey, this is what this lever does and this is what that lever does. And then, 6 months later, a year later or something, I come in and I say, okay, now we learned it this way. We're going to change it. We're going to do it this other way now. And we thought we had this figured out. It turns out now there's this edge case, and I'm going to throw all that away and we're going to start doing it this other way. And sometimes we end up barking up the wrong tree, but we figure those things out and we course correct on that, and sometimes oftentimes, I guess, we find many paths that lead us to where we want to be. But I think that helps the collective problem solving as well, because we learn which paths are essential and then which ones are just optional. Like, Ross, you've really learned I think it's really cool how you and I have converged on a lot of these same ideas around training, around listening to your body, really. It's just that a lot of my path has been externalizing these things and finding ways to put numbers to it and bring it outside of my own head, where your path has been to turn more internally and kind of reinvigorate the old school approach of learning how to surf that, like how do I actually read these signals as they happen so that I can surf it? But we're both like trying to get at the same thing, which is a training program that's responsive to the individual, so that moves as the individual moves, and John, I see the same thing with you, and I see the same thing with like all of our coaches. Like we all have like these little nuances to how we do the thing, whether it's, choices and tendencies in programming, preferences for one solution versus another solution. And sometimes those things are just mere preferences, but then when we come across something that's essential, something that's like, hey, no, I actually think this is like really for real better, you should try it. And then we can try it and see like, oh, okay, so how do we reintegrate this into the system? And then all the other coaches get pulled again. So we have to continually update those systems and continually strive to be better coaches.
Definitely want to highlight the fact for everybody that, that it can be difficult when we develop something, it works, and then Mike throws it out the window because he comes up with a new idea and a new strategy. But in all reality, like I'll admit, the first time that happened when I started working for you, I did get a little frustrated. Like, oh man, I just got used to like this thing, and now I got to like learn this thing and start trying to figure that out, and like, oh dang it. And then I reminded myself, like, but that's the way. Like, that's what I'm doing as a lifter. I am constantly trying to strive my way for more. So why would that be any different for me as a coach? And ultimately, like, that's the thing that, like, whenever I'm at a gym and there's the perpetual bodybuilder versus powerlifter headbutt, I like to point out the fact that we're all the same at the core foundation of what we're trying to do, and that is we refuse to wither away on the couch in weakness. We just have a slightly different way of expressing it. So if we start out from that foundational element that's important, we can get along and we can go along somewhere so much further and more meaningful. And that really helped me, like, not be frustrated in those moments, but go, oh, okay, well, what does this new thing do for me, and how can I integrate it and use it as quickly as possible instead of being resistant to information?
Always building a better mousetrap.
All right.
So I had a question for you, Mike, kind of related to that. So when you think about RPE Origins, you developing that system, bringing that system to powerlifting, and then Ross had mentioned emerging strategies. What problems were you trying to solve? Because that's what this is all about, is trying to solve the problems. So what problems were you trying to solve with emerging strategies? And second part of that question, do you think differently today? Has it led to other problems that you want to solve because of the problems you've solved with emerging strategies?
Yeah, I mean, well, the easy answer here is that it's all connected, that one problem leads to a solution, and then that leads to other problems, and you continue down the rabbit hole. But hopefully it gets you closer and closer to what's essential, so gosh, I mean, emerging strategies itself as a concept is kind of big. So it solves a bunch of different problems that are in some ways related, but just to kind of narrow it down, one problem that I noticed pre-emerging strategies is we would be training a client, and the block is written in whatever it is, 4-week blocks or 3-week blocks, whatever is. At the time, 3 and 4 was kind of the given solutions. Like you wouldn't do anything else, so mostly 4-week blocks. But we would get to the end of the block sometimes, and especially in peaking blocks, when you're like a week or 2 weeks out from the competition, I would get this problem where lifters would just have the floor kicked out from under them when it comes to strength expression. Last week they did 200 for a single at 7, and this week, 190 is like a single at 9, and they're like going, what the hell? So it's like this big shift in strength, and it comes out of nowhere, and it was not explainable from fatigue. Like that's the classic default explanation. It's like, oh, you're just fatigued. You need a deload. Well, I'm 12 days out. Like I can't deload, right? That's no longer an option at that point. Or even when you're further out, that we would deload, but it didn't really solve the problem. Like we're not better. We're just kind of restarting a new block. It wasn't fixing anything. And this was a problem that just kind of went on, and I noticed it, didn't really have great solutions for it. We would just kind of work around it and cope, and it just kind of sucked. But then there were some other issues that came up. There was a book that I read in 2009 called Squat Every Day. This was kind of back the last time that powerlifting was infatuated with the Bulgarian system and maxing out every day. We're a bit overdue for another round of Bulgarian obsession. So if anybody wants to start off the trend by maxing out it every day, then that would be great. But it won't be me. But I read this book called Squat Every Day, and it's written by Matt Perryman, who I thought was a really clear thinker, good author. And he talks about a lot of problems in top-down planning models and problems with kind of imagining the map as the territory, right? Like you have this plan, and this is the plan that's going to make you stronger. Well, the plan doesn't make you stronger. The training, if it's the right training, can make you stronger, but the plan is just a plan, and there's more to. There's a whole podcast you could do on just this one problem, right? But there's a number of different problems with top-down planning. And I kind of felt that a little bit, but reading it said out loud by another person really helped crystallize it, And so now I'm like, I can't unsee the problems. There's these problems with the way that I'm writing training, but how do you solve it? All these problems with top-down planning. So how do you do bottom-up planning? Well, you can max out every day. Okay, great. Like, I don't want to do that. So what do I do? And there just wasn't a solution, So I thought about it and thought about it and thought about it, got really nowhere for like 6 years. And then one day, it's 2015, and I'm driving to the airport to pick up my brother from the airport. And I've got this podcast going called the All Things Strength and Wellness podcast. It's a really great podcast if you're interested in looking it up. But there was this interview with a Canadian throwing coach named Derek Evely. And Derek got to live for a while, a couple years, with a famous Soviet hammer throw coach, Dr. Anatoly Bondarchuk. Bondarchuk had moved to Canada, and while he was kind of getting on his feet again, he lived in Derek's basement, which is a crazy thing to think, like you have like one of the most, probably the most decorated Olympic coach of all time living in your basement, and you guys coach together, that's a pretty wild story in itself. But I'm listening to this interview with Derek, and he's like, look, you can read the books, you can read Transfer of Training. I had read Transfer of Training. And he's like, you wouldn't read those books and just understand the way that we actually did the training. It would be, you wouldn't read the books and come away with the system. And then he goes on to explain like what they actually did in very simple, straightforward terms. And I'm thinking, holy crap, that's a bottom-up planning approach. That's the that's an example of a solution to this problem I've been racking my brain about for the last 6 years, you know? And so I got really excited. I pull over on the side of the highway and I start scribbling these notes on like how to start to translate this program from Bondarchuk and throws into powerlifting. You know, different sport entirely, but the principles will translate, you know. And that became kind of the origins of emerging strategies. Now back to the original problem I'm trying to solve here, right? That I have this problem of we would train for a while and then all of a sudden strength just falls for no obvious reason that doesn't seem to be connected to anything. Well, one of the principles that we learn in emerging strategies is this concept of finding an athlete's individualized time to peak, right? That we're going to train and we're going to repeat the microcycle stimulus. And as long as you're improving, we're going to keep going. And we'll find out how many exposures does it take for you to get to a peak condition. And this turns out to be a pretty stable number. And it can change a little bit over years, but you know, for the most part, from one block to the next, it's pretty stable. And we can use this reliably to peak for competitions and so on. So for somebody, they might peak in 5 exposures, 5 weeks. So we'll write their program for 5 weeks. And for someone else, they might peak in 3 weeks. So we'll write their program for 3 weeks. And I think now what was happening before is we would just run these blocks for a little bit too long. And especially into the peaking block and things like that, and some other nuances around emerging strategies that we know now, the blocks were just a little bit too long and they were going past their peak condition. And it was this sustained performance dip. And that's why it didn't rebound with a deload and things like that. It wasn't fatigue related in that same sense, right? So that solved the actual material problem for us. We were much, much better at peaking after that discovery, right? The thing is, as you continue to go, you continue to think about it for a long time, you start to think like, well, we don't have exposure counters in your muscles. There's not like some organ that's inside the muscle fibers that's counting the number of sets of squats that you do. It's got to be something else. There is something happening here. We've seen it repeatedly over decades, you know, like it's not a myth. And then this style of programming solves it. But what is it about the programming that solves it? So we go deeper into the rabbit hole. We try to figure out what this thing is. And like we think now that it's got something to do with athlete psychology, and we think that it's got something to do with the central stress is maybe like this proxy measurement for it, and that there's, you know, factors around how much does the athlete have to psych up when they come into the session. There's things like that, right? And could you write a more traditional program that respected some of these variables? And yeah, you absolutely could. You know, so there's like the solving of the actual problem, but that leads you to somewhere else. And can you solve it even better than before? So long answer to that question, but I think that's a really fun problem to get at.
I was just going to say what I took from that was having a predictable peaking environment, right? Just that's one of the hardest things with competition is training could be going so well, and then you get there on the day and it's just not the way you were expecting. And it sounds like emerging strategies created this framework for you to reliably and predictably peak athletes into a meet and have that expectation. But then as you start doing that, it's like, well, why? Why is it if we run 4 of the same training plan over and over again, do we get to this exposure and just suddenly we're plus, 10 kilos out of nowhere? Why is that happening? And then how do we optimize it even further? So that's the question I have for you now is, so how are you optimizing already on this concept and trying to make it even better? Instead of a 10 kilos, can we get 12 and a half? Can we get 15? So where are you tinkering now and thinking?
So a lot of this can be, there's so many layers to all these programming questions, right? And I love exploring these rabbit holes. But the emerging strategies process at its foundation is supposed to help you peak reliably, just as you said, peak reliably. And then over time, we will peak optimally, but we've got to get reliable first. So one of the first things that we teach about peaking with emerging strategies is what we've come to call the no taper approach, where you know that you peak reliably on week 4 of the program, let's say. So what happens if you are training for a competition? We'll just put the competition on week 4 of that program. You might rest for 2 or 3 days prior to that competition just to dissipate whatever short-term fatigue you might have, so you don't like show up to the competition with acute fatigue, right? But we already know that week 4 is a reliable peak performance for you. So we'll just start there. Is it optimal? Well, maybe not perfect, but it's a pretty damn good start, and we can build on that. First, we'll start here. And then over time, maybe we discover like, okay, well, things are a little bit better if we taper the volume down, or maybe just cut some of the accessory work a little bit sooner, or oftentimes push it a little bit later. Maybe we'll make that last week a little more specific or a little more explosive. So we can tinker with the things to make it more optimal. And it often will start looking like a semi-traditional deload in a way, but there's individualized wrinkles to it. There's individualized nuances to it that make it yours, that make it optimal for that one individual. So we start with reliable and then, push toward optimal. Is that where you wanted to go with it?
I think that's a great way to look at it. The more information that you have about reliably peaking on time, the more you can measure and come up with optimal, and you can iterate on optimal. And I think that's one of the things as a coach here that I love about emerging strategies, and shameless plug for, emerging strategies. It's the opportunity to measure what worked, what didn't work, and going beyond that to what works even better. Like, hey, this actually was your greatest rate of gain block. These strategies, this combination of tactics and programming variables led to the best. So we should do that. We should do that leading into competition so we can reliably and optimally peak and have the greatest performance on the day. And that's the thing that I took away the most after taking the courses, being a coach for a long time, using emerging strategies. Now, Ross, I know that you were one of the first people to go through emerging strategies and have Mike do that with you. Would you say that that's been your observation too, in like as an athlete as well as a coach, that this tool just takes it to the next level when you're optimally helping athletes to peak into competition?
100%. But I wouldn't even call it a tool, right? Like emerging strategies is a system to help you know which type of tool and which category or which specific tool in that category to use, right? If we think about it, I often like to draw analogies to tools because the hobbyist woodworker in me can't help but think about that. But like, there's over 40 different types of hammers. And you can't use any one of those hammers in any one specific situation. You have to be aware of what you're doing, what you're about to do, and pick the right hammer. And I look at emerging strategies as a system to help guide you towards selecting which hammer to use in which situation. If you want high rate of gain, you're going to break out the 20-pound sledgehammer and you're going to smash it. But if you need to be precise going into a meet, you're probably going to want to use the finish hammer and get in there and be a little bit more precise with it. So like being mindful of those things are like, this is just a system to help guide you into being able to gather and understand that information and what you're trying to do with that. Without that system, without some way to do that, like how do you get that? And I think that was one of the core things to think about when I was learning it from Mike, is that idea too, like thinking back to like block periodization, like, yes, it is a program, it is a system that works for some, but it doesn't work for everyone. And because block periodization it does not have the ability to like change the hammer. It's just a hammer. It's just going to drive things. And it can't change. It can't use a different hammer in a different situation based on who the person is, right? Like the peak block in a block periodization is the same for every single lifter. Well, maybe that lifter can't handle peaking with the sledgehammer. Maybe they need to dial it down. And emerging strategies is that system to guide you to the right tool.
You know, you reminded me of a experience I had, and I shared this in the course back in 2016 or 2017 when I took it. I had an athlete where I gave her a volume block. Pretty typical. You do that away from competition season. So I gave her a volume block, lots of 8s, lots of 6s, and she's doing a volume block, and her performance by the end of it was just gangbusters. I'm like, wow, we have never seen that before, but we have a meet coming up. It's like, well, we ought to do the thing, right? What do you do? We ought to put in singles, triples, we ought to do the peaking block, and we start doing that. And then what do we see? A regression in strength. Mm-hmm. And when I started taking the emerging strategies course, I was like, so if I was using emerging strategies, I might flip this entire thing. One, I might not actually run a peaking style with her at all. Like, why would you? Maybe we're running 8s, maybe we're running 6s into a meet. And as long as she can execute on the day, that's what matters.
Yeah.
It might make a headache for attempt selection, but who cares? If she can perform on the platform and be optimal, well, that's what we're after. So I just wanted to share that as like an example of what I think you're talking about, Ross.
Yeah. And as you started to say that too, the other idea that came to my mind for clarity on that analogy is that the hammer is the protocol. Which protocol are you going to use for which situation?
Yeah.
Which hammer can that person yield? Which protocol can that lifter yield? And is it effective? And we've seen over the years that there's a lot of people. There's a reason why like block periodization gets developed, because most people will fit in there and it'll do pretty good for most people, but there's still a lot of people that it doesn't work well for, or it's not quite there for others, even though it kind of works, but it doesn't quite work all the way. So there needs to be some tweaks and changes. And this gets at that.
Nobody's average at everything, right? You brought up a good example of like how many, I guess I should just say many systems will try to lock you in to a certain way of doing things. And it makes sense, right? Because it is easier if there's structure. Block periodization is easier to implement in a lot of ways because there's not a question about what sequence should the blocks go in. You start with accumulation, you go to intensification, you finish with realization. That's just the way it works. You wouldn't run it in reverse. That doesn't even make sense, But I've got to say, like, when I was training Brett Gibbs, we're getting ready for the 2018 Worlds, and I'm looking at his training, and we're like 3 blocks out, and I'm like, I remember having a program meeting with him and being like, look, man, every time, if we look at your deadlift, every time your best results from the deadlift come from this like lowish intensity volume work. So like lots of volume in like the 75% range. And then like the 80% range is kind of our next best thing. And then actually the high intensity stuff is okay. It's not bad, but it's not great for your deadlift. So we've got 3 blocks to go. I think we should just run it in reverse. We'll start at 85, then that'll save us the 80 and the 75 as we peak into this competition. So we actually got lighter as we went toward the competition. and he pulled magnificently, pulled a world record. He was the first, he was at the time the heaviest powerlifter to total 10 times body weight.
Lightest.
He was the first 83 to no, he was the heaviest.
Yeah.
Because there had been 10 times body weights before, but first 83 to break the 830 kilo mark. And yeah, so it went great. I was nervous as hell the whole time, bro, because it's just one of those things where, it all makes sense on paper. If it goes well, then that's great. And that's how it worked out. But it was also one of those things where, like, man, I hope this works.
And I remember taking that course, and I remember that time period when you had been doing the course and sharing that information. And it gave me the confidence actually to go against previous systems. And I think that's what's neat about emerging strategies is the proof is in the pudding. You're either getting stronger or you're not. The goal is the goal, and you can measure it. There are peak conditions. There are these time points where you get to, and you can say, this is better, this is not. How do we get further? And Ross, you said something earlier that struck me. Block periodization works probably for most people. And there's these, hey, we can expect that we do this and we could get some results there. Then we go to this, then we go to that. But I think the more you get into the sport and the more passionate you get, I think you have to ask yourself the question, is that enough? When you start working with athletes who are trying to be the very best in the world, all things be damned, you want the very best. You don't want the mediocre block. You don't want the plus 7 kilos. You want the 10, you want the 12, you want the 15, you want more than that. And in this day and age where you have to continually break world records, and you got to save those world records for when it matters, there's a lot on the line and you want optimal. Yeah. And so that's kind of where I go to of like, even the average powerlifter could benefit from knowing what they respond best to. And that also doesn't mean you can't run block periodization and go from, a volume block to a strength block to a peaking block. You could do that, but at some point collect the data and find out what you're responding best to,
For sure.
Yeah.
And I think
absolutely. Like the whole idea with emerging strategies, sorry, Ross, I'm stepping on your toes here. The whole idea with emerging strategies here is that the long-term plan emerges from the short-term plan. We have to first see what are your shorter-term responses before we can start to figure out the ideal long-term response. Otherwise, we're just making a bunch of assumptions. And, like I said, nobody is average at everything. So, going back to my Brett Gibbs example, we did this weird reverse pyramid thing with his deadlift, but that wasn't how we trained his bench. He needed something else for his bench. So one system couldn't answer all the questions.
Thing that I wanted to highlight in conjunction with all that is, like, I understand and I really get why a block periodization or a Bulgarian method gets popularized. Like, it's fun. Like, the closer you get to the meet, the higher the intensity you get to jack the load up, the more weight on the bar you get to do. Like, that's the whole reason why we power lift, is because we want to put more damn weight on the bar. And those are programs that allow you to put more damn weight on the bar. But that doesn't mean that it will truly allow you to put more weight on the bar at the end of the day. Like, is that really going to drive the adaptations? Does that stimulus drive the adaptations for true strength gains and expressions in reliable and predictable ways in which we're after? And in some cases, absolutely. In some cases, they do. But in most cases, they don't do a good enough job. And I think that's one of the things that I've appreciated about you the most, Mike, in observation of your coaching, not just in the way that you write emerging strategies, but also in the way that I've seen you write training for yourself, is you have a willingness to explore and experiment with things that don't fit the mold, of block periodization or the thing that you should do. You're willing to do those sets of 10s or 12s or the mile reps or that awful oxidative crap that you come up with. Like, Like, you're okay.
Or weight releasers.
Right. You're okay to do some torturous work and not be afraid of it. Like, let's play with this thing. It's weird. It doesn't fit the mold of powerlifting, but we're going to do it anyway and explore what kind of adaptations this different stimulus will do. And even it might not be necessarily a one-to-one effect, but it might be one of those things that develops work capacity on the other side so that you can withstand the volume work in that volume block to have the adaptations. It's not just a one-to-one thinking process. You're going at it in different layers to break it down and see those different perspectives.
We definitely learned something from all those weird experiments. I mean, even if it's just learning, what didn't work, that's maybe undervalued in a lot of ways. The example that you gave earlier, John, about like an athlete who just didn't respond that great to higher intensity stuff. So then, Bulgarian training becomes popular again. And, do you think, well, should I have this athlete do even more high intensity? Well, probably not. I mean, you would need something pretty unusual to happen for that to be a viable strategy for that individual. So like even learning the stuff that doesn't work points you in the right direction to the stuff that will, that you explore these different options that you have. And you're always trying stuff that you think will work, right? Like you dig into this and come up with a theory of like, this will work. This will make me stronger, and sometimes you find that you're incorrect on those things, but that's useful to know. That way you can do the right things when it counts the most. Hey, if Ronnie Coleman was a powerlifting coach, he might have said, everybody wants to build custom training programs, but nobody's got a process for how to do it on the regular. We do. You see, most coaches rely on trial and error, and that's fine if that's your jam, but we wanted a coherent process. Way back in 2015, when I had already been coaching for over a decade, I finally had learned enough from enough sources that I was able to put the pieces together into one coherent process. We call it emerging strategies. The bulk of our 16 world record-setting powerlifters set those records using an emerging strategies program. We talk about emerging strategies a ton on this podcast and everywhere. If you ever want a single thorough explanation for how to implement the emerging strategies process, well, that's the emerging strategies course. The emerging strategies course includes 8 modules. That's almost 24 hours of video instruction covering everything. We teach fundamental concepts and basics all the way through integrated examples and case studies. You can watch it at your own pace, as fast or as slow as you want. Oh, and the RTS community, our private community that offers you just a stupendous amount of value all on its own? Well, if you enroll in the Emerging Strategies course, you get 6 months of that community membership for free. If you have any questions about some concept, you just post it in the network or jump on a live office hour call with one of our RTS coaches, and you get your answer. If you'd like to enroll or just learn more, to include seeing a full lesson list, all you have to do is go to reactivetrainingsystems.com and click on courses in the main menu. You're going to love it.
Related to that, Mike, so I had this thought, and it was a question for you. What does failure tell you that success often hides when it comes to systems and coaching?
It's a much better teacher. And I mean, I think this will probably not be terribly surprising for a lot of people, but you try a block and it works, right? Let's say, to use your example from earlier, John, like let's say it gives you plus 10, plus 10 kilos. That's really good. That's worth being happy about. But this is always something that comes up when we start talking about this in practical terms, and coaches actually start implementing emerging strategies. It's like, well, how do I know if a block was successful or if it wasn't successful? Well, you have to look at the blocks. If you got plus 10 on a block, but all your other blocks have been plus 15, well, then plus 10 isn't really that great anymore. But if you've been getting like plus 2, now plus 10 looks amazing. So it all has to be read in context. But when you do something and it works, you learn that thing worked. And when you do something and it didn't work, then you go, well, this is broken. Like I have to open it up and like look under the hood and actually understand something new, because it should have worked, right? It was supposed to work. Otherwise you wouldn't have done it. So what went wrong? What went wrong? And I suppose that's the part where the learning happens, right? It's not the fact that the block was a failure, but it's the fact that the failure forces you to figure out what went wrong. And it creates an opportunity for you to figure out what went wrong, more so than the reverse, because the block was supposed to work and then it worked. So there's not really a lot you can take apart there. I mean, you can get into the details and find smaller things that didn't work maybe. And that's a good thing to do too. But when you have a block that didn't work, those are opportunities to really course correct and really hone in on the things that make the biggest difference.
I think a thought to add to that too is that the failure forces you to look at the action steps that you've taken and reassess the action steps. Whereas when it's successful, you fail to question. You don't question, what action steps did I do that actually created this success?
Yeah, and I mean, it's just easy to assume that all the actions you did must have been right, because it led to a good block. And I mean, they were at least sufficient, I guess. They didn't derail you enough that, the block, all of a sudden was unsuccessful. So it's true in that sense, but it's harder to tease out those lessons. It's confirmatory, but it doesn't really give you much in the way of course corrections.
Yeah, like I was sitting here thinking a successful block leads to replication, but a block that is unsuccessful, and we're using these words and that can mean different things to different people, but an unsuccessful block leads to you essentially interrogating and going in further to find out why. And the why can matter a lot. It could be intensity, it could be volume, it could be stress. I mean, all the variables. But the why ultimately leads you, hopefully, to a place where you actually can get to optimal.
Yeah. It's that course correction that is the stuff that leads us down the path. That's how we follow the trail of athlete response, is through making those course corrections. So of course we try to stack up wins. We try to create successful blocks, but we just also know that the reality of it is that they won't all be winners. They can't all be winners. Like, that's just mathematically not how it works. So you may as well learn from the ones and get the course corrections so that you can be more successful more often. That's it's an intelligent way to train, I think.
You even see that with tapering, right? Like Hayden Pritchard, when he worked at RTS, I remember him talking about how, there's all this information that we have about tapering for strength sport, but his practical recommendation is try this approach and try that approach and try that approach and find the one that works best for you. And it's so like, it sounds so non-scientific, but at the end of the day, that is the process of discovery. You can find that you might need more bench work leading into your competition. Maybe you're benching the day before your competition, or maybe you're finding out that, hey, like I have an athlete that has to taper his deadlift 21 days before a meet. That completely changes the mold for how we peak into a competition. It's very different than other athletes that I coach. But at the end of the day, that's what's repeatable and reliable for him. and not even just repeatable and reliable, but optimal. We've done other competitions where we're like, let's try 14. It was okay. But 21, that's it. That's the dynamite every time we do it. So why would we do it another way if that's what worked best? Another thought I had thinking about this is, Ross, you've talked about this in The Intentional Athlete. There's this opportunity to explore your edges that's really, I think, beneficial. So, Mike, you've been deadlifting something ridiculous like 12s and 10s. Like, who does that? You're not doing CrossFit, Mike. You're doing powerlifting. Come on. And it's like, but like, it's been beneficial. It has actually been beneficial. You're seeing your E1RMs go up. You're getting stronger. And I don't think you know that unless you start going down that trail, unless you start evaluating and trying and exploring your edges to say, well, if 8s were good, what about 10s? What about 12s? You know, in before you start doing 20s, and then that's it. We're over. But, you know, I think I think that's how the self-discovery process goes, right?
100%.
Yeah. And
yeah,
we all have these different tendencies that we have as coaches and baggage that we pick up along the way, like a resistance to training high rep deadlifts is a great example, you know. And I mean, I had that. I would almost never program more than maybe 6 for deadlifts. Maybe if we were further away from competition, I'll program 6s. But then when we started doing more velocity testing, we start building these velocity profiles, these individualized velocity profiles, start understanding what are we learning from this profile? Does this profile tell me something about programming? Yeah, I think it does. Okay, well, the profile is telling me that I need to be deadlifting 12s. And if this was squats, I would absolutely squat 12s. So I don't want to deadlift 12. But why not? Like, if deadlifting 12s meant you could deadlift a PR, would you do it? Well, yeah, absolutely. So it was the nudge that I needed to explore that territory, and it was positive. So sometimes you just need the nudge.
100%. One of the things that I talk about with people, with the exploring edges, John, is when we talk about the concept of like exploring false limiting beliefs, we have to look at this in twofold and look at the fact that there are also very real limitations. Like, those limitations exist. Every single one of us has a physical limitation. There's no way around it. Otherwise, we'd all be, far stronger than what we actually are right now. But there's physical limitations that exist in terms of how much training stress we can handle, how quickly we can recover, how much food we can consume while staying the same body weight to be competitive in our weight class, and like all kinds of real limitations. And it's really, really important to be able to understand and pluck apart the difference between a false limitation and a real limitation, because a real limitation is very important, valuable information that's going to help drive decision-making and choices. Whereas a false limitation is when, for all intents and purposes, when you believe that you are less than what you're capable of. And that can come from a myriad of different places. And what's unfortunate about a situation like that is if you believe that, if you have that false limitation and you believe that, you won't get to explore your edge or your capacity. So, like, I like to explore that from a lens of like, oh, is this information or is this in my own head, in my own way? And a lot of times you don't know until you play around with it and explore that edge. And the analogy that I've started to use and talk with people is that you're navigating the edge of the Grand Canyon. The Grand Canyon is crooked. It goes all over the place. Some spots of the edge are a little rounded and you can feel the edge a little easier. Some spots it's just sheer straight drop off. And if you take a side step just too far, down you go. Oh, it's also foggy as all get out and you can only see 3 inches in front of you. Get to the bottom. Like, that's what we're doing. We're navigating the edge of the Grand Canyon in the fog. There's a ton of uncertainty. And the beautiful part is there's no actual, like, fear of death. So just go have fun and explore. Play with the edge. Sometimes you're going to go over it, sometimes you're not. But have fun. Play.
All I heard from that was doing 20s on deadlift is certainly jumping off the cliff into the Grand Canyon to the abyss. That's what I heard.
Yeah.
So I have a serious question for Mike. Thinking about that in light of exploration, we like to talk about exploration versus exploitation blocks. Exploration being we need to navigate around those edges and see what's really good. What direction should we be going? And then the exploitation is we know that this is the path we've seen and we feel that this will reliably get us to where we want to be at the pace that we find is acceptable, by the way. So how much of this can we systematize, Mike? How much of this can be data? How much of this can be a system? Or how much of this is intuition by the coach or even by the athlete?
Question. And I don't know if I have the answer to it yet. I think there's different ways to solve it. I don't know if I think about it carefully. I'm not sure if intuition is the right framing for it, because people that appear to be more intuitive in how they're judging training responses, in my experience, they're still like reading something real from the training. They're just in touch with what those signals are. They're interpreting them correctly. Then you have the other people who don't do that. And I would hear people sometimes kind of, back when disparaging RPE based training was a lot more popular, you would hear people say like, how heavy does it feel? It always feels heavy. If I listened to how my body felt, I'd never train. I'd just sit on the couch all day. Like, well, you're not really engaging with the problem here. Like, you're making a lot of assumptions about what does this mean. Anyway, there's a healthy, helpful reading of the signals, and then there's whatever that other mess is. And if you can read those signals like in your own head, in your own subjective language, then that's fine, because you end up doing the same thing at the end. My efforts a lot have been around systematizing and building systems to kind of export a lot of these observations to people who maybe aren't as good at reading the signals, but like, how can we help them get there? I think it's been helpful for me to externalize a lot of that stuff, because I guess in a lot of ways don't trust my perceptions, or it's not that I don't trust my perceptions, but I'm aware of my own ability to lie to myself. That some days, damn it, I just want to go heavy, and I'm going to go heavy, unless I've got a good reason not to. And I just need to externally provide that good reason if it exists, and vice versa too. Like, some days you don't want to train, and maybe you shouldn't, but then sometimes you need a kick in the pants too. Like, yeah, I know it would be a lot more convenient for your schedule if you didn't have to train today, but I mean, you can make that call, but your body needs the training if you want to get stronger. There's the extra interpretations that I would layer on for myself internally. So for me, a lot of it is like, okay, can I externalize this? Can I give myself some sort of reason to validate that perception or not? Some external steering. So I think the systematization of it is an attempt at that in a lot of ways. So it helps us teach, but it also helps us make sure that we're not deceiving ourselves and saying this is optimal when it's just what we would prefer.
I'm reminded of your article, which was posted 4,635 days ago, just in case anyone's counting. Strength doesn't care. Google it, read it. It's amazing. I read it probably once a year. It's true, right? Like, and I think that there's this bias that we have of being more self-aware than we probably are. Some of us are probably better at this than others. But if we're honest, all of us can fall into this trap of not necessarily seeing where the block conclusion is going and understanding in the training session the greater plan and being able to see what the outcome of that is going to be. It helps you make different decisions. If you're week 3 of a 4-week block and it's 2 blocks out from Worlds, is that the right time for you to YOLO? Maybe it is, maybe it isn't. I'm not judging. I'm just saying it's valuable to have that. You talk about the top down. It's helpful to have that too. You have to work both ends, I think. And I think what's great about emerging strategies is it's like, wait, let's pause for a moment and keep in mind that these top-down systems are pretty dubious and making predictions that you just can't possibly make. But at the same time, there's a date on the calendar somewhere. So we have to respect that, and we're a slave to that calendar. And whether you choose to train or not today depends on what's going to happen and the choices you're going to make next week. And sometimes, like you said, the answer is don't train. But that information has to come from somewhere. So I agree with you from a systems perspective. And I think that part of this is this evaluation of always making that decision in context, this session, tomorrow's session, next week, what decision do I make today?
Well, one of the things that I was thinking about was back, like what you were talking about with the systems of developing it so that it helps guide the perception and intuition, and it's not just all one-sided. And how, like you mentioned as well earlier, how we've essentially like have got to the same point, but from radically different ideas, because you've been leaning more into TrackR and like categorizing and logging how you're feeling physically to let that guide you into a system and have it turn loads up or down and change workouts. And like that didn't work so well for me until I just said, you know what, I just need to give myself permission to not follow any of this. And like for me, because the biggest thing was I found that the way that I was feeling would vary. And it would all be directed based on when I would fill the sheet out or log the information. And well, that would change all the time. And so I needed to make like in the very moment decisions. And the only way that I could do that was to finally give myself permission to break away from whatever the training was. And like that was just a really big different experience for me, because I am very much like, here's my structure, this is what we're going to do, we're going to follow it. So it's really interesting as well to know that that's something that drives me, and for me to lean in such a radically different direction in my training and have it work and feel good and be productive, I thought was really powerful and really helpful. And I get that can be difficult for a novice lifter. Like that would be really, when you ask me like, how would I teach somebody that? And I'm like, lift for 20 years and let's have a talk. Like, cause that's, totally. It's definitely like to this day, I still think about like, how would I teach somebody in their second year of lifting how to make those intuitive adjustments? And man, that's a hard, I still don't really know how to answer that question.
I like that you mentioned TrackR, and that's this experimental program that we've been working on for quite a few years. And it's kind of become like a test bed for a lot of different ideas. But But it's interesting that your experience has been what it's been, because the people that I've noticed who are most successful with TrackR as a experimental system are the people who are most willing to take it as suggestion or take it as like recommendation, that, the recommendation is that you do a heavy workout for a lot of volume, and they go, no, I'm not doing that. Most of the time they don't. Most of the time they say, yes, I'm going to take the recommendation, but sometimes they go, nah, not today. I mean, I did this today. It was saying, hey, you're fatigued from a heavy session yesterday. We should do the light active recovery thing today. And I was like, I know that's what it says. I know that I'm good for the volume workout. Maybe not something heavy, but I'm good for the volume workout, right? And I can make that decision to override the recommendation. I can do that. But then I also know what I'm doing is like, I know that I'm overriding something. I know that we've passed this threshold that I said was too much, and we're past that line, and that now I'm saying, yes, we're past the point where I said before that it was too much, but, and I can kind of have that negotiation with my past self in a little bit more real terms. So that means that it's not ready for prime time, first of all. Like, it's, if I'm doing that, then it's not teaching, it's not sufficient for that person who's got 2 years training experience, right? Because we're getting closer, but we're not there yet.
Yeah.
But it's like, I saw you work through this process when you stepped away from TrackR and started relying more on your own perceptions, that you had this back and forth where you were wrestling with it for a while, of, I feel like shit, but this is what's on the program, and I feel like I should do the thing that's written down, and then, oh, okay, I shouldn't have done that. I should have listened to my body instead. Or then, other times where it's like, how am I feeling right now? Is this actually me being too beat up to continue, or am I just kind of wussing out? And it's sometimes hard to read those signals, and I saw you kind of figure that out and like go through this process of learning.
Well, I think too, the thing that I struggled with, and that I think is one of those complex layers that I don't know where this would go in the derivation of that system, is I realized that when I moved away from TrackR, that I had a massive preference to letting the day be the day. And if that means it's a down day, then it's a down day. Meaning I'd rather Tuesdays at that time, that was competition deadlift day. And that's what it was. Whereas with TrackR, if I wasn't feeling well per TrackR, I would change it to something else. And I'm like, no, it's deadlift day. I don't want to change it. So it's like the structure of where everything was in the week needed to stay the same. And I needed to just accept a down day as it was a down day and let it be what it is. And changing that way helped me be flexible in the structure rather than the structure be flexible, because that was too much for me. And I think the other part of that too was the way that I was experiencing that hip issue was like, a lot of times I wouldn't feel it in the day-to-day. And I wouldn't feel it until I started to deadlift, and I wouldn't feel it until a very specific spot in load and a spot in the range of motion. So the second I started to feel like some of those very subtle warning signs of it being a thing, I was done, shut it down. And that very first block where I made that change and like promised and dedicated to myself that I would allow this experiment to go through, and no matter what, that very first deadlift session, I didn't even get through my warm-ups. I was done, shut it down. And then the next session, I got a few more warm-ups. And then the next session, I got to one top set. And then the next session, I actually got back downs. And it wasn't until about the third or fourth block of doing that I was actually week one getting all the deadlift work in. But I think that's the way to correlate it or quantify it for me, is that I needed to be flexible in the program and the structure rather than the structure being flexible around me.
It's wild how different athletes can be, right? Because like I'm thinking about Coach Mel, who has been working through a TrackR system, and she's more flexible with it than I am. Like she'll be in the gym doing some warm-up squats and just being like, no, I don't have it today. And just bag it up and come back tomorrow, and try again tomorrow. And tomorrow will be a great day, and I can't do that. Like mentally, once I'm there, I'm there. And I've had other athletes too who can see on the planning that today's going to be like a primary squat day, and then they fill in their recovery scores, and the recovery is actually not that great, and so it does what you said. It switches them over to split squats or whatever instead, right? And like I have, like I'm more similar to you, Ross. Like where I want my day to be my day, and I have this mental resistance to it, but some people don't, and they can just kind of roll with it and say, well, if today's not it, then tomorrow can be it, and I'll be flexible that way. I admire that, but I don't think I have that at this point in my lifting.
Yeah, I can be that way when I see like, oh, I'm going to have interruptions from life. I'm going to move this training around. I'm going to get it in. But if I wake up on Monday and it's supposed to be squat day, I don't want anything telling me it's not squat day. I'm going to go squat. I might not squat as heavy today if I feel like crap, but I'm squatting today.
This connects to something back to what John was saying a moment ago, with like the explore and exploit cycles, and this kind of marriage between top down and bottom up planning. Because the bottom up style is great in the exploring setting. But then as you get closer to a competition, you do have to peak on time. And so the exploit approach, or the greatest hits approach, is more of a top-down structure, but it's a top-down structure that we build for you that's based off of like all of your observed patterns and things like that, right? So it's not shoehorning you into a block that doesn't quite fit. It's tailoring the block so that it does fit, and that should result in more reliable peaking. And it's kind of this ideal marriage between the flexibility that bottom up can provide and the structure and the reality of having a schedule that top down has to facilitate. So I mean, and I think that's kind of where we're going with this. And Ross, like I think you and I struggle with maybe letting go on some of these primary sessions, but I'd be willing to bet that if your accessory bench day got swapped around for a different accessory or got moved a day later or something like that, that's probably not as big of a deal.
Yeah. Like if it got swapped out for more comp benching, that'd be cool.
I'm taking notes, writing it down. So it's a couple things, thinking about all the things we talked about. Mike, we're getting not too far away from 20 years RTS. It's pretty cool to think about. I think about that a lot, actually. And just even in the last 10 years, how prevalent RPE is in programming. It's amazing. Like 10 years ago, it was not as prevalent as it is today. It's so prevalent that people have no idea where it came from, which is pretty cool to think.
Sorry, I'm interrupting your question, but I want to tell you about I usually don't indulge in these kind of weird, surreal experiences and stuff, but lately I've been training at like this commercial gym a lot more often. And I was in there the other day just doing bench whatever, and there was this woman who was training her clients, doing a lot of like booty builder, whatever that they were doing. And she's talking about, you want to push your hip thrusts and you want to take it pretty far, make it a pretty hard set, about an RPE 9. And I was like, whoa, that's weird.
Just need some IG influencers. That's it, Mike. You're set. That's how RTS grows, just the booty RPE 9 workout, All right. So like thinking about that though, how prevalent RPE is and how pervasive it is in programming. And just like thinking about the last 10 years, emerging strategies. What did emerging strategies do? It said, hey, you know what? You don't need to run the same traditional system that you would if it doesn't work for you. If it does, great. But if it doesn't, you can break the mold and that's okay. And that has led to the golden microcycle. It has, right? Like everybody talks about that. Well, it's like, yeah, you create a training week, find predictability and peak on time. Yep. Emerging strategies. So, when you think about the influence that you've had just in the past 10 years, thinking ahead, the next 10 years, so we're sitting here, we're almost hitting 30 years. What do you want coaches and athletes to be better at? And then what systems would you love to develop to help them to get better at it?
It's super hard to predict something 10 years away, by the way. Let's start off by saying that. I can tell you the space that I've been doing a lot of work in recently has been everything velocity based. That we've been really tackling velocity, which has been something we've used in training, and I've personally used in my training since like 2009. So it's been around for a long time. We've known its utility for a long time. But I would say recently, in the last handful of years, it's gotten to be more and more accessible, and it's gone beyond just like an RPE validation. I think it still is that, right? Like it gives you this objective lens into your RPE. It helps you to put the right weight on the bar and lift it the right number of times, which is huge in training. But there's a lot more we can do with it from there. And it runs this range from being athlete focused to being very coach focused. On the athlete side, I've got athletes who are using it, and it improves their in-session decision making without a doubt. That I can give an athlete a velocity device, and just some basic instruction like, hey, we're working up to a top single at an 8, and that should be between this speed and that speed, And I've noticed that just with that, their decision making will improve. Instead of taking massive jumps from one week to the next and inevitably overshooting, but telling yourself that you're not overshooting until the very end, and you're like, well, how come this was such a grinder? Like, well, because we've been lying to ourselves for 3 weeks,
Shots fired.
Like,
that's it. I'm out.
Well, like it's these have been problems with RPE since the beginning, like since always. It's just structural to it. And the way out of it is something that's a little more objective velocity. And you can just regulate with so much more precision. And even if you don't, narrow the range, the athletes narrow the range themselves. Instead of taking a big jump, they take more conservative jumps because they know they've got to, they have to land within that velocity range, and it's going to be unforgiving. And, it's also easier to sell yourself on the upside too. Like, well, I'll just take a little more conservative jump and I'm just going to smoke it. Okay, great. Yeah, do that, and then that can leave us some headroom for the next week. So I think there's tactical level decision-making for athletes that improves for sure. It's not just your top sets, it's your back offs, it's your volume work, it's your secondaries, it's your accessory work. Like it can improve basically anything as long as you're willing to do the data side of it, which is still a little bit manual. It's still a little bit user intensive, but we're going to get there real fast. This isn't going to take a long time to solve. Then more on the coach side, coaches have watched how athletes move forever. And we know certain things about certain athletes. Some people are super grindy lifters. Other people are super explosive lifters. And then you have like the differences in technique and range of motion and all these different things. And this is all informing some of our programming decisions. But again, like externalizing some of these internal processes. If you look at a velocity profile, I'm finding more and more that we can do with that on a programming level too. That it can give you a nudge in terms of what rep range should you train with. Does this athlete need to train, like maybe you're in a early cycle block, and so you're trying to do more structure-oriented training, but it's not like a full-blown hypertrophy block, right? So do you need to be more in the 4 and 5 rep range, or do you need to be more in like the 8 or 10 rep range? And I know a lot of people are going to say, who cares? What difference does it make? Well, then this isn't for you if you're thinking like that. Like, we actually care about figuring this out because there are differences, and some people are going to thrive in one setting and not in the other. And I want to know which is which. So one of the ways that we can tell is by velocity profiling. And more than that, we've been able to start to identify these types of people with this type of profile need more explosive work, and what constitutes explosive work for that athlete. These other type of people need more high RPE grindy work, and what constitutes high RPE grindy work for this particular athlete. So starting to narrow in on stuff like that. And oh, by the way, there's still a bunch of training strategies that you can use within that. This doesn't really solve the problem of multiple strategies. It's not just like one strategy to rule all of them, but it's another way to look at individualizing something like a rep scheme or a training protocol that fits what that athlete's capabilities are. So, I mean, again, this all kind of centers around velocity and velocity profiling, but it can be helpful for athletes in tactical ways, coaches in strategic ways, and probably some other ways too that we're just starting to learn about.
I was just looking at an athlete's log, just had a conversation with him about how we saw a massive drop in velocity from reps 4 and 5 in a set. And we've been kind of hovering in this bench, like between 10 kilos, and it's just not moving. We're like, what's going on? And we've worked together for a while, and we started looking at the volume that he was doing, the down sets, and looking at some of the velocity loss that was happening. And being able to have those metrics allowed me to have a conversation with him about his experience, because he's noticing the same thing. He's like, hey, when I go from my 4th rep to my 5th rep, there's a huge drop in velocity, and like it gets grindy out of nowhere. And it started to make me think, well, maybe we need to be training before that happens. Maybe we need to construct protocols that have this happen. Oh, and when we do a set like that, all the other sets, it happens too. And we've got to cut reps if we want to stay away from that. And so you're right. You're getting closer to individualizing the protocols to drive the adaptations that you want. Look, there might be periods of time where you want that. There might be reasons to do it.
Yeah.
But there's intentionality behind that. And the athlete has to be behind it too. Like, hey, look, you know what? We care about your 1RM. Of course we do. But you know what? We need some hypertrophy. So we've got to deal with some of that right now because we're playing the long game. Or, hey, you know what? We actually want to preserve skill maintenance. And so we probably don't want to do these things that can get in the way of that. It changes how we construct the training week. It changes how we construct the protocol design. It changes all the things. And so I think you're completely right, Mike. I totally see velocity becoming a much bigger thing in the next few years, let alone 10, especially with the apps that are coming out and being able to use your phone. And, you know, the tether device is amazing, but it is kind of annoying to set up and it kind of gets in the way. But at the same token, you know, if we can continue to see these developments and integration with technology, that just makes us better as coaches and as athletes. I'm also surprised you didn't talk about fatigue. And it's kind of a breath of fresh air to not hear Mike talk about fatigue and, his yammering at 2:00 in the morning about fatigue management. We can all remember that period of time. Ross, you remember it. Mike is like...
I actually didn't lose my mind. Yeah.
We get these like thesis from Mike, like, I had this thought about I couldn't sleep and, but we joke about it, and
we'll make you sick of velocity that way as well.
That's right. How far do you see yourself going down the rabbit hole of fatigue management and workload management metrics?
Pretty far. I've been having more and more conversations about probably the individualized stress index algorithm, I guess. The individualized stress index system is going to be the next thing, and then building more ways to do training monitoring, recovery monitoring. Like, I think that stuff is super important. So again, like the TrackR system itself is an experimental system. It'll probably stay that way. The longer time goes on, the more I think that's probably what will happen. But we'll be porting over the best bits and pieces of it into kind of the RTS mainstream system. So like the stuff that we like, the stuff that is more reliable, the most reliable, and we'll be bringing that stuff in. And I mean, all this stuff wiggles and changes, right? So as soon as you think that you've got it figured out, something changes, and then you have to update your models and shore things up and fix things that were good at the previous level but just don't quite hold at the next level. I mean, velocity is another one of those things as well. We were talking about velocity profiling, and this is kind of a edge thing that I've noticed, is that some velocity profiles seem to be quite stable, and then others change really quickly. And I think I'm noticing a trend in the people that I'm coaching. We're doing a lot of profiling with them, where if the lift is stable, then the stuff that works just works, and we can kind of keep doing it. But then the lifts that where the velocity profile is changing, adapting rapidly, we just have less certainty. The things that work change more often, and we have to update what we're doing. We'll update what we're doing, and it'll work for a while, and then it'll stop working a lot faster. So there seems to be like a rate of adaptation difference, and it can be different between lifts too. Maybe your squat is super stable and your bench is not. And so bench training has to become a lot more adaptable and variable than squat training, or vice versa. So, I mean, that could be a trend that continues to flesh out, or it could fade away depending on how we get more data in.
I think the key to leave everybody with here is that there's going to be a constant evolution of reactive training system web tools that allow coaches to get away from Google Sheets.
Bomb dropped. That's it.
Yeah, I hope so. We've got so much stuff that we're working on, and that just ways to make training better, to put the right weight on the bar, lift it the right number of times so that you get stronger, actually stronger. And it's not just like, well, just keep lifting and hope for the best. No, like, we want to see progress. We want to see big progress if we can get it, and consistent progress at least, and continue to progress towards setting PRs as long as we can.
Shh. There is a secret to great training programs, but it's not a magic set and rep scheme or this one weird exercise that powerlifting pros don't want you to know about. The secret is in your training log. You see, years ago, we began developing tools to help you unlock these secrets, and we've been putting them online for free ever since. That's right, it's free for everybody. Now you may be thinking, what's the big deal? People have been logging training forever. And you're right, but the secret isn't just in keeping a logbook. It's using that log to make better training decisions. That's the real secret. This is where the RTS training log excels. You haven't done SSB squats in 3 months and you're wondering what your target weight should be? We can help you with that. Did you overshoot on your top set and you're wondering if you should adjust your back off sets? We can help you with that too. Are you building the most important training block of this year and you're wondering what your most highly effective blocks have in common? Yep, we got you covered there too. There's more. There's a lot more. And yes, it is all free. Not just a free trial, not free with ads, just regular free. You go to reactivetrainingsystems.com, then you click on apps, sign up for a login, and you're in.